Thanks, Stevie. Tonight, once again, my regularly scheduled series has been interrupted by current events. Last month, we were derailed by the primary election, and we talked about the Christians' approach to politics in general and how we needed to uh, make sure that we weren't attacking each other on political grounds and using political bigotry as a way to uh, be a sort of test of faith, as it were. Tonight, obviously, we are in the midst of extraordinary circumstances with regard to the social distancing quarantine that we are under with regards to this COVID 19 virus. And as we mentioned last month, we are dealing with some more Christian on Christian violence, as it were, uh, when this subject comes up. And so we want to make sure that we are having the proper perspective, spiritually speaking, with regards to our response to COVID 19, to social distancing, to quarantine, and to specifically uh, the idea of closing the church building um, in order to protect the health of our members and our neighbors as Christians. So the title of this lesson, "Be Alert, Not Anxious," is intentionally borrowed from a doctor on YouTube, Dr. Mike. I don't know if you are familiar with his channel, but that has been his mantra for this entire period while the COVID-19 virus has been going out. We need to be alert. We need to be aware of what is going on, aware of the severity of the threat, aware of the recommendations that are being made, the pronouncements that are being made. But we should not be, as Christians especially, anxious or fearful or scared or worried so much about those things. Um, it is a saddening thing to see when we go to the grocery store and we see people. We've all seen the videos of people hoarding toilet paper, hoarding canned goods, fighting each other over uh, such items in the aisles of the store. Um, that is obviously not very Christian behavior, and as Christians, we need to understand that we need to set an example. Um, and fearful panic buying uh, is not a good look for Christians. I think we all know what the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, starting at verse 25, says. Jesus says, "I tell you, therefore, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not your life more than food, and the body more important than clothes? Look at the birds of the air; they do not sow or store in barns or reap, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? And who, by worrying, can add a single hour to his life?" Again, Jesus tells us not to worry about the necessities of life, that God will provide these things. And it's hard sometimes when we are in the midst of something as extraordinary as this. We have not seen anything like this in our lifetimes. The last time we had something similar to this was back in 1918, the Spanish flu, and I wasn't around then, and most of you weren't around then. So this is a new situation in our lifetimes, and there is reason to be somewhat skeptical about the nature of the information that we're getting, and I'm not going to criticize people who are skeptical about the information, because I understand where that skepticism comes from, and I sort of share it with you. At the same time, I know that I am not an expert in viruses or infectious diseases, and you are probably not one either. So we need to understand that there's a flip side of this coin. So not being worried and having faith in this situation does not mean that we should be cavalier about our approach to COVID-19. I'm going to have to mention this because it's necessary to the point that we're trying to make. There's a preacher that I know from California who posted on Facebook that if your congregation is not meeting because of COVID-19, then you and your congregants are, quote unquote, a bunch of sissies for not having the faith, I guess, to go out and brave this virus and continue to meet in your congregations. And that, I have to say, is highly uncalled for. The Bible tells us not to worry. The Bible tells us not to have fear. But it also tells us that wisdom is the principal thing. James chapter 1 says if you want wisdom, you ask it for God, and God gives it to us liberally. Wisdom is something that God values highly. The entire book of Proverbs is focused on the concept of wisdom and how God expects us to have wisdom, and all of these sayings are given to us in order so that we could apply wisdom in various situations. And in this case, wisdom is telling us that this is a viral infection that is highly contagious. The scientists are telling us that this is much more contagious than the flu, much more contagious than the previous possible pandemics like SARS and swine flu, and that it will have serious ramifications for our population. It will have serious ramifications for our population if it is able to get out uncontrolled. I don't know the demographics of your congregation, but I know that Waterview Church of Christ, where I do my work, we have about 700 members. I would guess about, being conservative, about 25% of that 700 is elderly people in the high risk category for this virus. They're telling us that the elderly people who catch this virus have about a 15% mortality rate. So, doing some rough math, that's about 20 to 25 people in our congregation who would be at risk of death if we were to brazenly continue to have worship service in the midst of this outbreak. And that's just the people who would die. Many multiples of that would become sick to the point where they would need to be hospitalized and not die. many more multiples of those would catch the virus, not be sick to the point of needing to go to the hospital, but definitely be able to spread that virus throughout the community, which would cause many multiples more to get sick and to die. Is that something that we are willing to risk, number one, as uh, being a danger to our own congregants? And number two, is that being a good neighbor, being a good steward to uh, our friends and neighbors that we come in contact with, to, because of our own quote unquote faith, expose them to a potentially deadly virus? I think we all understand that is not a wise thing to do. And it has already been reported in the news that a woman who in Stockton, California, attended worship with her congregation because they were going to continue to worship regardless of what the authorities said. And she has just passed away from the COVID-19 virus, and that she caught from being in that assembly, and other people in that assembly have tested positive. And who knows how many more people will die because of their intentional decision to go against what the recommendation of the doctors and the scientists who are studying this virus and are trying to contain it so that it doesn't get out of hand. See, our friends like this preacher are going to point to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, that says, "Don't forsake the assembly," and say, if you're being afraid to come together to assemble just because the authorities are telling you to, you're just acting out of fear, and you're not trusting that God is going to deliver you from this virus. And, for some people, there may be some degree of fear. But I think most people understand that this is not about fear. This is about wisdom. And this is about understanding that a virus is not something that you can control. Once you get people together, if anybody's infected, you're all going to get infected. And there's nothing you can do about it. It doesn't have anything to do with your faith per se. It just has to do with the nature of this disease. And I think the people that are telling you this, they think that you're operating out of fear, but they're really the ones they're operating out of fear. They're operating out of fear. Maybe they're operating out of fear that the government is using this as an opportunity to take away our religious freedoms. Even though many of the people who are making these decisions are Christians themselves and have no intention of preventing congregations from meeting on a long-term basis. This is an extraordinary circumstance, and hopefully, if we do it correctly and we get this thing contained the way that we want to, or that we need to, it will be a short and temporary situation, diversion from our normally scheduled program. Or maybe you're in the worst case scenario, you're afraid of God. You're afraid that God has no common sense, for lack of a better term. That God is so inflexible about his rules that there can be no exception, there can be no extenuating circumstances. God has no ability to understand the situation that we're in. He only will see that you missed service, and that is in and of itself a sin. Therefore, you're going to lose your salvation, or you're going to lose your place in heaven because you didn't go to church when you were sick. And if that is your thinking, if that's the way you really feel about God, then you have a problem with your theology. Um, God has rules, God has standards, but God is not above or not inconsiderate of the circumstances when it comes to those rules in all cases. And we know this because if we go back to 1 Samuel, we see David when he was on the run from Saul, and he and his men needed something to eat. Where did they go? They went to the priest. They ate of the showbread that was from the tabernacle. The showbread wasn't lawful for them to eat. The Hebrew writer will tell us that it wasn't lawful for him to do that. But God didn't strike him down for doing that. God didn't say anything say that it was wrong for him to do that, or chastise him for doing that, or take away the kingdom from him for doing that, because God understood the circumstances. That at that time, David's life, sustaining his life, sustaining the lives of his men, was more important than the ceremonial aspects that he was violating. And in this case, saving the lives of our congregants, our elderly, who make up in many cases the bulk and the backbones of our congregations, to intentionally put them in danger, to gamble with their lives, as Paul phrased it, for no reason, because we want to prove to God that we are more committed than the people who chose to stay home. I think it's in these cases like these that we forget that the building is not the church. We chastise people for not coming to the building and closing the doors of the building as if the building is the church. The building is not the church. We are the church. The church can never be closed because wherever we are, that's the church. So worship will continue. Church will continue because it can't be closed. It can't be shut down because wherever we are, that's the church. We may not be able to gather in the numbers that we're used to gathering in. Last week they said that we couldn't gather with more than 250 people, and then middle of the week they said we couldn't gather with more than 50 people, and now they're saying we can't gather with more than 10 people. Fine. Jesus says where 2 or 3 are gathered, I'm in the midst. So the number of people may be smaller, but church is going to continue. Worship is going to continue. And this has nothing to do with fear. We're not anxious. As the Bible says, be anxious for nothing. In everything, give thanks. We're giving thanks because we still have our health. We're giving thanks because we still have the things that we need. We're giving thanks because we have this opportunity to worship in a way that actually is more close to what they were doing in the first century. In the first century, they didn't have buildings. They worshipped in each other's houses. And yeah, maybe they weren't limited to 10 people. But maybe in some places, that's all they had. So if there were 10 people, there were 10 people. If there were 2 people, there were 2 people. And we can worship. And now some of us are connecting to each other through the internet, and I have no issues with that. I don't think that there's anything scripturally wrong with having multiple locations linked through a video, as long as worship is taking place in those locations as well. I don't think that the video substitutes for worship, uh, but it can be a complement to worship. It can definitely provide the preacher with an opportunity to get the word out, the message out. This is why we do this show. This is why we do the Facebook Live shows. We try to get the word out, and getting the word out is part of the worship experience, along with the singing, along with the taking of the communion. Of course, the communion has to be done with other people, and that's why you're there. You gather with your 10 people, or your 2 people, or your 3 people, and you can take communion as a group. You can listen to the sermon online. You can sing songs with each other. You've had worship. No one has forsaken the assembly. That forsaken is the key word there. Forsaken doesn't mean I missed it once unintentionally, or there were extenuating circumstances that caused me to miss it. Forsaken means I've left it and I have no intention of coming back. As long as haven't done that, we haven't violated Hebrews 10:25. We have every intention of meeting. We can't meet at the building because the authorities aren't going to allow us to, and with good reason, because there's something out there that is making people sick, and we don't want to catch it, and we don't want to spread it. That is wisdom. That is not fear. So we're not forsaking the assembly. We are moving the assembly. We are reconstructing the assemblies into something that is novel and something that is different from what we're used to. But worship is going to continue. I have no intention of not worshiping this Sunday, even though I'm not going to be at Waterview's building. And yes, we may not have the experience of having the 700-member chorus that we usually have, but I've had many a powerful song service with just 10 people, just 5 people, just 2 people. Don't worry about it. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything give thanks. And the God of peace and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. That's what we need right now. That peace beyond understanding. That peace only comes from, number one, knowing that God is in control. Knowing that this situation is going to be temporary, that God is going to use this situation to bring good things out of it and allow us to see His power working in a powerful way if we allow it to. If we don't allow our fear of the virus to cause us to panic, or our fear of the government to cause us to act recklessly, or our fear of God to cause us to cause our brothers and sisters to stumble over things that are not worth fighting over. There's no reason to call your brother or sister a sissy because they don't want to meet in the building with everybody while the pandemic is going on. That's not fear. That's not being a sissy. That's wisdom. So, I encourage you this Sunday to enjoy worship with your families. Enjoy worship with your close friends and neighbors. We haven't forsaken the assembly. We're just moving to a smaller one. Don't go out and panic buy pallets of toilet paper. Just get as much as you need and Leave the rest so that somebody else can get what they need. Get the food that you need, and then leave the rest so someone else can get what they need. I encourage you to reach out to those who are vulnerable and at high risk. Make sure that they have what they need. If you have to give to someone, give to somebody who needs what you have. And let's allow the world to see the love and the power of Christ through our actions, so that they can see that we are alert, we are aware, we are responding to the situation, but we're not anxious, we're not worried, we're not fearful. We're moving in a powerful way in order to prevent the spread of this disease, and also to make sure that everyone is taken care of. So that is the lesson for this evening. I hope that it is received in the spirit that it is given, and I really hope that we can understand. Again, God is in control. This is going to play out the way it's going to play out, and there's not. And if God wills it to play out in a certain way, that's His will. But in the meantime, we have to understand that we don't have to. Actually, let me add this one thing about why I'm thinking about it. Because this thought just came to me, and I think that we need to address it. The people who are out there here saying that if you don't go to worship or go to your church building to worship in the midst of this pandemic sound really a lot like the devil in Luke chapter 4. So remember in Luke chapter 4, the devil tells Jesus to cast himself off the hill, because the Bible says that God's going to protect him. He won't even let your foot be dashed against a stone. And that's the same way that a lot of these preachers sound when they tell their congregations that we need to keep coming to the assembly, because God says if we have faith that He's going to protect us, that He's going to heal our sicknesses and make sure that we don't catch this virus. Do you remember how Jesus responded to the devil in that situation? Jesus said, "Do not tempt the Lord your God." And that is what we're doing. When we are intentionally walking out into a dangerous situation because God's going to protect me, we are tempting the Lord our God. We don't, and we don't do this with anything else, right? We don't say I'm going to blindfold myself and walk across freeway traffic because God said He's going to protect me. Right? We don't drive without our seatbelts on because God said He's going to protect me, and I'm not going to get in an accident because I'm blessed and holy and sanctified and highly favored in the sight of God. I have faith in God, but I still look both ways before crossing the street. I have faith in God, but I still wear my seatbelt when I drive my car. Faith in God does not... Faith in God's protection does not mean that God is going to put an invisible force field around you and make it so that you never get hurt. And if that's the way you teach, and if that's your theology, then what happens to your faith when you do get sick? What happens to your faith when you do get injured? When you get, God forbid, you get cancer or get something like that? What's going to happen to your faith? I know what's going to happen to your faith because I've seen it happen to people that when they believed that God was supposed to protect them and then they got cancer and they went to their pastor or their priest and their priest that person said, well, it's just because you didn't have enough faith. What do you expect them to do? How do you expect them to respond to that? They're going to walk out the door and they're never coming back. And they're going to hate God because of it. Because your theology says that God is supposed to be a force field for the faithful. And if God isn't your force field, then you just aren't faithful enough. That's the wrong theology, and it's the wrong way of looking at God. God is a provider of our needs, but that does not necessarily mean that God is going to protect us from everything that could possibly harm us. Sometimes, Paul himself wasn't healed from all the things that harmed him. The thorn in his flesh, God refused to heal that because he needed that experience to humble him, to give him perspective, to give him something to talk to people about. A trial, a tribulation, a situation that he had to go through and overcome in order to perfect his faith. See, faith can't be perfected in protection. Your faith isn't really faith if you've lived in a bubble and in a force field. James tells us that our faith is perfected in trials. That's why he said, count it all joys when you fall into various trials. The trial is what perfects your faith. The going through something with God, the struggling with God, is what perfects your faith. Israel was called Israel. That Israel means to struggle with God. That was the whole point. That we're going to have to wrestle with God sometimes. That realization that God is there, God is in control, God has the power, the ability to protect us, the ability to heal us, but He's not always going to do it because we need to go through stuff in order to learn to have faith in Him. That's kind of a tangent from the rest of the lesson, but I think it's necessary for us to understand it, that this poor theology, this wanting or expecting, expecting God to have a relationship with God without. So I encourage you to, if that's your understanding of God, if you are one of those people who has the idea that God, if God is God, then He needs to protect me. You really need to check your theology on that, and that will give you the compassion to understand that people that are responding in wisdom and trying to protect their neighbors and their brothers and sisters from this outbreak are not doing it because they fear God or they fear what's going to happen to them. They're doing it because they understand that is what is best for their neighbors and for their community. So, that being said, the lesson is yours. Please listen to the authorities, do what they're telling you in regards to not spreading this virus, avoid crowds, stay home as much as possible, make sure that you are only taking what you need and not hoarding. Be smart and make sure that your neighbors are taken care of. And don't be afraid, don't be anxious. We'll all get through this together. God is in control. And He's going to make sure that everything works together for the good of those who love Him and obey His commandments. So, lesson is yours. Thank you for your time, and keep listening to the Gospel Light Radio Show.